sixth session of our seminar, of our webinar, Social Movements and Social Change in a Global Pandemic. And today we are very, very pleased, Brenna and I, to welcome two researchers that will talk from different perspectives and different countries. And we have the team today of the both Alexandra Kay on one side, Alexandra Cassir, who holds a PhD from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. She's now teaching at the American University in Beirut, and she's also postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Lebanese Studies. So she has written extensively on the citizens' movements against conventionalism in Lebanon, and of course that's a really very insightful movement, not only to understand what's happening today in Lebanon, but also to reflect on citizen movements in different countries. So she will start, and then afterwards we'll listen to Kate Alexander, that I guess everyone knows. So she's very active, not only researcher, but also activist. And she's currently the director of the Center for Social Change at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. She has published widely in comparative labor history and social movement studies. And she's very active, actually both very active in the research committee 47 of the International Sociological Association, Social Movements, and we have Breno is the president of this committee, and Alexandra is on the board. And Kate has been very active. She's been presenting in at least 2 or 3 last congresses. She's been presenting very insightful paper on trade unions and activism in South Africa. So both of the texts have already been published in Spanish in our book. This is called Alerta Global, Políticas y Movimientos Frente a la Pandemia. And this book in Spanish is available for free online. And we also sent you the text of the forthcoming book in English that will be published in February, right, Breno? And then that we obviously talk about very often in the following sessions. But you all receive the text, I guess. So, Breno, you want to say a few more words before leaving the floor to Alexandra?
No, not really. Nothing more to add to this nice presentation. Simply welcome everyone as well, both those who are here at Zoom and those who follow us on the Latin American Sociological Association Facebook. I would also like to thank Kate and Alexandra for being with us today. As Geoffrey said, I think we have 2 different contests under discussion with 2 people who know firsthand the popular movements, the protests that have been take place in both countries in recent years. So let's listen to them.
And just, of course, we will have, as always, a Q&A session afterwards with short comments or questions. So you ideal case is that we will open the floor and you will just speak up with your mic and your camera on. You may also always leave questions in the chat, but we will in any case give you the floor after these 2 talks. So thank you very much, Alexandra and Kate, for being with us today. And I leave the floor to Alexandra for about half an hour.
Thank you very much, Geoffrey. Thank you, Breno. So I will first start with some context and give you a brief overview of the current situation in Lebanon today. So to sum it up, it's a context of multiple and overlapping crises. And I will particularly show you how the Lebanese authorities, since the outbreak of the pandemic back in February, are very much enforcing a police state under the guise of public safety. Then I will discuss what happened to the October uprising since the outbreak of the pandemic, and I will show how the uprising did not enter a period of latency, although street protests remained overall very much scattered, with some exception that I will come back to later. And I will discuss how the activists very much sustained their grassroots efforts in different ways to build the country they aspire to. And then I will end my presentation by raising some questions and also with some very recent updates I was just telling Kate and Breno about earlier, about the student elections that are happening right now, and an hour ago we had some of the results. So I thought of sharing that with you, and then we could have a discussion. But first, a little bit of context and a short timeline of events. So the past year was probably one of the most tumultuous years in the recent history of Lebanon. It started full of hope with the October uprising and ended tragically with the Beirut blast on August 4th, 2020, which you probably all heard of since it was one of the biggest non-nuclear explosions in history. It killed more than 200 people, injured thousands, and basically it destroyed half of Beirut and left around 300,000 people homeless or displaced. All that happened at the time of a global pandemic. Lebanon confirmed its first case of COVID on February 21st, 2020, so first month after the beginning of the uprising. And the COVID outbreak very much compounded the existing economic and financial crisis. And what I mean by that, what I'm referring to here, is the rapid devaluation of the Lebanese currency, the capital control imposed by the banking sector, the inflation in food prices, the salary cuts. So just to give you some numbers, as of May 2020, according to ESCWA, so the Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia, it was estimated that more than 55% of the country's population has been living under the poverty line, and that was before the Beirut blast. So now back to October 2019, and particularly to the evening of October 17th, which marked the beginning of the Thawra, as we call it here in Lebanon. Thawra means revolution in Arabic, and this is how people from the very first days have been calling the mobilization. So the October uprising, the Thawra, as we call it, was triggered by the government decision to impose new taxes, including one on WhatsApp calls. But it can't be reduced to a mere anti-government protest against austerity measure and against corruption. And from the very first day, people were calling for a revolution to overthrow the established political orders. So hundreds of thousands of Lebanese from different age groups, social backgrounds, took to the streets to call for change and for the downfall of a political class which ruled the country for the past 30 years. 30 years. So the rallying class of the people was all of them means all of them. And politicians across all the political spectrum were named and shamed. People ripped down their posters in the street. They openly insulted them. So that was the general. Really, people were fed up, and it was that was the main, the main rally. So the economic crisis and the austerity measures were the main drivers of the protests, and it is important to highlight and insist on people's mounting frustration for the past few months prior to the uprising, and their mounting anger. And their waning faith, basically, and trust in the governing party's ability to manage the crisis and ensure their basic needs and rights. So to give you an example, just a few days before October 17th, wildfire ravaged the country, and the state basically failed to contain them due to the lack of maintenance of its firefighting equipment. So that was the general. It's not the first time Lebanon witnessed important mobilization against sectarian powers. And back in 2011, there was a series of rallies echoing the uprising and calling for the downfall of the sectarian regime. Also back in 2015, after the garbage crisis triggered the Houston protests against the water system. And there were also very big mobilization. But the October uprising was very much a turning point. First, clearly because of the scope of the protest. There were massive, leaderless, peaceful protests across the country. And what is important to emphasize here is that unlike the typically Beirut-centric movements in post-war Lebanon, the October Revolution was inherently decentralized. So the major cities, small towns from north to south witnessed this unique explosion of anger and hope. And maybe more importantly, for the first time, neighborhoods and cities, which are known as a stronghold of sectarian political parties, were at the forefront of the uprising. Also, while anti-sectarian mobilizations are usually instigated by political groups, so not referring to traditional political parties, but to student organizations, feminist collectives, leftist parties, or NGOs. On the evening of October 17th, people spontaneously took to the street with a wide range of seemingly unrelated demands. So there was really a very broad range of demand, but it all stemmed from the same need to break free from the grip of the sectarian powers. And people were voicing their anger and condemning the sectarian oligarchy. Youths were at the forefront of these protests. They were reclaiming the streets and very much embodying the unity they aspired to. And if we think of the first image of the October uprising, we have the image of people raising the national flag or joining hands to form a human chain along the coastal, seaside across the country. But it was much more than a symbolic display of national unity. It was really an affirmation of a Lebanese identity against the system that segregated its citizens along sectarian lines through different personal status law and the system of quota also for political representation. So also in their slogans, for example, the protesters were very much expressing solidarity with each other and connecting different neighborhoods which were supposedly on the opposite sides of the political spectrum. So in the first few weeks, the mobilization were very festive, full of color, dance, music. It was almost like a celebration of people transcending their sectarian divides, saying, we're here, we're together, and we want to turn the page of the civil war. So I don't want to romanticize it, but for the Lebanese people at the time, it was almost a dream, like a magical moment, which very much widened the horizons of possibilities at the time. 4 months later, February 20, 2020, the COVID outbreak, the pandemic spread in the country, and the outbreak very much offered the sectarian oligarchy a golden opportunity to consolidate its power, to tighten its grip on the country, and to basically threaten the last remnants of democracy in the country. So just to clarify, it's not the first time, that protests were being repressed by the state. That's far from being the case, but it very much intensified with COVID. So at first, the government very much downplayed the risk posed by the virus. And for example, it delayed the suspension of flights from highly affected area. But then by mid-March, authorities announced a state of general mobilization and enforced a series of measures. And then these measures throughout the past year, they have been, extended, tightened, using dependingly. But the lockdown measure very much restricted the freedom of movement and assembly. For weeks, a curfew was imposed. There were also different ministerial decrees which regulated the circulation of cars according to their plate numbers, odd, even numbers. Military and security forces were deployed nationwide. There were checkpoints. The army, the police were patrolling the streets in an effort to contain the pandemic, but also the protests. So after the uprising built a certain momentum following weeks of massive street mobilization, really the spread of the pandemic at this particular time gave the newly appointed government, also at the time, a convenient reason to suppress the protest. And from the very first day when the curfew was announced, riot police completely dismantled the Revolution Stand in Martyr Square, so it's in downtown Beirut. Despite, there were only a few protesters and they were taking some of the basic sanitary precautions. And this was also the case in the Noor Square in Tripoli, in North Lebanon, and in different regions. And as soon as the protesters attempted to reclaim the streets, authorities systematically retaliated with violence. And since October 17th, in fact, the use of excessive and lethal force during protests very much worsened. So tear gas, bullets, pellets were fired directly into the crowds, indirectly into the eyes of the protester. It caused hundreds of injuries. This was very much denounced by Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, so on. And on April 27, 2020, hundreds of people were gathering in Tripoli, so in North Lebanon, to denounce the dire living condition. It was during lockdown, and the army fired live ammunition to disperse the protesters. And the 26-year-old protester Fouad Saman was killed, and many were also seriously injured. So, and the Stalinist militants were persecuted, arbitrarily arrested, often subject to torture. And while the squares were being emptied, attacks on freedom of expression also very much intensified. Activists were interrogated, even for writing their opinions on social media. Lawsuits were filed against journalists and media outlets. Also were asked to obtain a certain point permission from the army to film in public spaces. So it was pretty much extreme to the extent that even the lyrics of very popular patriotic songs were censored during a televised celebration of the Lebanese Army Day, just to remove the word revolution and to replace it with music. And authorities also very much took advantage of these heightened security measures to hold parliamentary session, place controversial bills on the agenda, particularly a general amnesty law that would further entrench impunity in the country. And they obviously rejected the protesters' major demands, but also they very much failed to address the devastating impacts of the multiple crises that hit the country. Likewise, in the aftermath of the Beirut blast, a state of emergency was also announced, and it granted sweeping power to the army, while the country was already in a state of general mobilization due to COVID. So it was a further attempt also to undermine the popular uprising and cause people's anger in the wake of this catastrophe. So during the protest on August 8, which was a few days after the blast, also even hunting guns were used, excessive tear gas was targeted First Aid Station, and to use some of the protester words, what happened is that they were firing tear gas on those who had no tear left and live ammunition on those who survived. So I'm quoting some of the protesters. So to sum it up, whether under the guise of public safety or national security, authorities very much retaliated with violence every time people attempted to reclaim the streets. So clearly, the pandemic has posed a significant challenge for the activists. Just to say the least, it wasn't an ideal time for street activism and for politics in the square. And given the obvious fear of infection, but also the different restriction and the repression and state violence that I just mentioned. So at first, in the very beginning of the pandemic, protesters attempted to reclaim the streets. And so at the very beginning of the pandemic, Tripoli, which is the second largest city of the country, as I told you, and which is also the most impoverished one, became the epicenter of the uprising. And for the protesters in Tripoli, hunger was deadlier than COVID, and they said it very explicitly. You could see it in the banner, and it pushed many people to the streets. And you know, a few weeks into the lockdown, we could really see the difference. So the festive mobilization that were reclaiming the street with dance, music, really far behind. And people also were more and more resorting to violence. So they were smashing banks, they were throwing stones, they were clashing with security forces. But here is very important to clarify that this was uncomparable with the police and the state violence. So security violence retaliated with extreme violence, tear gas, rubber bullet, and as I told you earlier, one of the protesters was killed. So also, although the activists defied on certain occasions the lockdown measure to protest, for example, in front of police stations where activists were detained, to protest against the military trial of civilians at time, they organized also different rallies and sit-ins to call in front of universities, for example, against the commodification of education, in front of different ministries, in front of the central banks, for to call for their demands. But overall, the capacity of mobilization of these protests remained very low. And they also, like the activists also tried to organize car protests to respect social distancing. So people would basically just drive to a certain location and block the road, but while being in their cars. So despite these attempts, overall street mobilization remained very much scattered during lockdown, which is very understandable. in this case, except for one big exception that I just mentioned, which was the August 8th protest, which was a few days after the explosion. And at the time, people couldn't contain their anger anymore. They went into the streets. They went to Martyr Square in downtown Beirut, which is a few meters away from the port. And this protest was under the banner "Justice for the Victim, Revenge from the Regime." And it was really an explosion of anger. Just to give you an idea, you could see people in the streets who were heavily injured during the explosion, protesting. People forgot about COVID at the time. And after being literally killed in their home, for them, the government was way more dangerous than COVID. And they explicitly said it in their banner. They were saying, the government, my own government killed my people. This was what they were saying out loud. And because also it's important to remember that the presence of the ammonium nitrate was an open secret among the key decision makers. And the Lebanese president himself had admitted that he has been made aware of the security risk it disposed nearly 2 weeks prior to the explosion. So besides this very particular and exceptional moment of protest during lockdown, since the outbreak of the pandemic, street protests were very much scattered and very low capacity of mobilization. But this doesn't mean that the uprising entered a period of latency, and this is what I will try to show you now. And what happened is that protesters sustained their grassroots effort to build the country they aspire to in a different way. And maybe here I will just stop for a second to add a little bit of context. So to understand the October uprising, of course, we need to look at the social, political, and economic context in which it occurred. But it is also important to look at the history of the anti-sectarian movement in post-war Lebanon, and at these youth-led grassroots efforts, which very much contributed to build up and to build up and contribute, to this mainstreamization of an anti-sectarian discourse, which paved the way for the uprising. So, to a certain extent, the attention to the unanticipated scope of street protests in the first few weeks of the uprising kind of overlooked this long and often invisible struggle of the post-war anti-sectarian movement. And the reason why it was to a large extent invisible, so the post-war anti-sectarian movement was invisible, is precisely because it wasn't essentially centered around street protests, for many different reasons, but among which the fact that access to space in itself was a struggle for the protester, because we're talking about a country which is very much divided along sectoral lines because of the usurpation of the privatization of public space. So that's a different story, but this is to tell you that there was a struggle for space, for physical space, and that was prior to the pandemic. And so that's one of the reasons why for the past decade or so, anti-sectarian activists have been very much relying on digital activism, and social media platforms were privileged spaces of mobilization and were the main challenges through which they mobilized and were able to build and sustain a growing network of activism. So this is to say that digital activism is not something that emerged during the pandemic. And so we can't say that there was a shift, from street protests to digital activism, but it's something that always existed and played a critical role, and even more so since the October uprising, and even more after the outbreak of the pandemic. And the activists were very much using these spaces to organize, to debate, to live stream protest, and to really assert that the revolution is ongoing. So on the 6-month anniversary of the revolution, there was a trending hashtag, "We will be back." In the same way, we could see the burgeoning of alternative media platform, and which had a very independent editorial line. They're very much, have a right-based approach. And they also very much contributed to open a more democratic space in a media landscape that is very much controlled by the sectarian oligarchy in the country. So throughout the year, and these different platforms succeeded in building a growing audience and facilitated the mainstreaming of an anti-sectarian, anti-establishment discourse. And since 2019, they became to a large extent the voice of the uprising. So what happened during the uprising is that the protesters resorted to alternative forms of activism. And these forms of activism, so essentially, as Geoffrey would call it, an alter-activist mode of engagement, very much characterized the post-war anti-sectarian movement. And so what happened is that whether they were at home or in the street, protesters didn't stop very much didn't stop living their ideal. And they very much tried to embody their transformative visions in their everyday practices through daily acts of resistance. So they called for their rights through tweets, also by banging pots at night, through graffitis, through signs hanging on their window to share the hotline to fight the surge of domestic violence, during lockdown, but also through their everyday practices. So as the economic crisis very much exposed the country's heavy reliance on imported products, and with the surge of food price and the economic crisis, so on, and the lack of strategy from the government to enhance food security, the activists increasingly began to grow their own food, and the gardening community very much flourished on social media. It very much started back in November, December 2019, during the uprising in the Noor Square in Tripoli, when a group of activists planted in the square some vegetables. And this is where they founded Haba, which means basil in Arabic, and then they started growing and to advocate for a more sustainable food system. And their success was immediate, and today we have more and more initiatives to encourage local production, to revitalize the agriculture sector, and to promote self-sufficiency. So they are very much booming across the countries. Also, I'm just looking at the time. So yes. So also, after these years of coercion and cooptation of the labor movements and trade union by the sectarian power, during the October uprising, we witnessed the birth of interest-based alliance and the revival of professional association. Although they very much struggled, and they're still struggling till now, to translate their demand into an alternative political and economic project. But with the deepening of the crisis, and even more so after the blast, activists went into survival mode. And they resolved to really just take matters into their own hands through direct social actions. So several groups that were born during the uprising, also along with some well-established anti-sectarian collectives, student groups, feminist organizations, and so on, they very much channeled their energy to support those most affected by the crisis. And while the protesters' massive participation in the relief effort might raise some concerns about the depoliticization of the movement, and we could also discuss that later, it cannot be reduced to its sole humanitarian aspect. And through these daily acts of solidarity, people very much sustained their fight for social justice and strived to challenge the political economy of sectarianism. So, for example, they urged donors not to disperse emergency aid to the Lebanese government, but directly to those in need through independent civil society organizations. They also fiercely rejected the donation of the sectarian party. And through different initiatives, the idea was to try to liberate from the grip of the sectarian power those who might be bound to accept their conditional offer. And so they also, cleaned the rubble, organized fundraising, distributed food baskets, found shelters for families in need. And all that was very much an attempt to challenge the political economy of sectarianism. And if we look at the immediate response to the pandemic, the state response to the pandemic, we could very much see how the authority have a vested interest in maintaining the underdevelopment of public welfare, and how they tried very much, how they delayed first during the pandemic the arrival of the emergency aid, or and if we look at their lethargic response after the blast, and how it was then followed by an attempt to control the relief efforts, by the army, and so on. So these seemingly, humanitarian-centered, efforts were actually very political acts. But now the question one could ask is that beyond, so many Lebanese people were very much participated, you know, in this effort, in the humanitarian effort after the blast. So we had the activists and the other non-activists. And the question today is how we could really make somehow politicize this, and to what extent those who are not part of this traditional activist circle would see their action as political, or whether they would see it as a political, and it's something that is challenging the political economy of sectarianism. So that's something. So maybe to conclude, today we're almost a year after the onset of the uprising, and basically all the grievances, the rampant corruption, the waning faith in the governing parties, all these grievances that drove people to the streets are as prevalent than ever. And for some, the October protests seem like a distant memory. While, of course, the obstacles are massive, the militants are struggling to find today the best way forward and to devise a roadmap to address this multi-layered practice. But through daily acts of resistance and alternative practice, they are laying the foundation for structural change. Now, the movement is constantly trying to reinvent itself, to reinvent politics, and to open breaches. And maybe I will end with that. And so one of and with what just happened, like in our early years. So now we're having student elections in different universities, and for the first time, the students at the Saint Joseph University in Beirut, so the independent students, like the activists, won most of the seats in the student bodies, and this was the same case at the American University of Beirut a few weeks earlier, and in different universities. And in this context, it's also important to remember that the voting age in Lebanon is 21 years old. So these election results are very much revealing. So this is maybe to end on a little note of hope in the end, and then maybe we'll going to discuss that further in the discussion.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. I think that this was a broad and lively panorama of what's happening. What has happened in the last year in Lebanon, but also I think that it connected very, very well with other topics that have already been discussed here, notably in the first sessions, particularly when it comes to the countering the idea of a depolitization of the movements, on the opposite, that daily actions, concrete actions in daily life are also political and prefigurate somehow a different society. So these are very important topics. Most of them, not all, because you want to be below your text, which is great. It's updated. Most of these topics are also in the text that most of you received. So if you haven't read it, I invite you all to read it. And we will collect questions for Alexandra, but we will discuss it after the second presentation by Kate. So Kate, I leave you the floor, and I think you have the PowerPoint, so let's see if it works. It still works to share the screen, hopefully, fingers crossed. Kate, are you around?
I'm here. Can you see the presentation?
No. Okay.
Can you see it now?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, now it works.
There we go. Okay. Great. Well, thanks very much indeed, Jeffrey, and thanks very much, Bruno, for inviting, and thanks very much, Alexandra, for that fascinating presentation. What I want to talk about is going to be very different from Alexandra, but I'd like to start with three contexts, and the first of those is like a theoretical context. I just want to bring to the fore two items that I found very stimulating in the last few months. And then I'll move on to talk about some other things. The first of these is an article by Anki Daniel and Dieter Neuber, which was actually published last year. And they're writing about A, civil society, and B, social movements. And they ask us to consider the extent to which African experience should lead us to modify understandings of these two key concepts developed in the global north. They treat the former as normatively loaded and closely linked with notions of liberal rights. As part of their discussion, they contrast professionalized NGOs, which are part of the development industry, that are excluded by their definition, and NGOs with a political or social agenda and supporting constituency, which they include. Social movement is seen as a broader concept, not normatively loaded, they say, and not restricted to a certain notion of society. As a phenomenon, social movements stretch from some that are reactionary to those concerned with expanding democracy and possibilities for equality. The point is, they are movements, they mobilize. The authors accept that a variety of forms of social organization is larger in Africa than in the global north, and they acknowledge that overlaps exist between civil society and social movements. Nevertheless, they are opposed to any blurring of the distinction between the two and would prefer, it seems, that we give consideration to unusual cases that might assist us in developing new theory. I hope I haven't misconstrued what Anki is saying, but fortunately, as with Jeffrey, who I want to go on to, they're both present and they can correct my representation of their positions. So let me go on then to Jeffrey's article, which was written in the first part of the pandemic before the Black Lives Matter campaign. And it's easier to summarize his position. Citing Malucci 1985, he urges that social movement studies advance beyond a focus on protests to pay more attention to less visible aspects of social movements. We should, that is, go below the top of the iceberg. Taking us in this direction, he notes that activists have focused on 5 roles. One, and this is under COVID, 1, protests that re-emerged in some countries despite sanitary risks. I suppose Lebanon would be a very good example of this. 2, defending workers' rights. 3, mutual aid and solidarity. 4, monitoring policymakers. And 5, popular education. With this broad perspective, Players is, or at least was, I don't know what his position is today, I assume it's the same, Players is, it seems, rather positive about social movements. Now at this stage I want to park these two perspectives, allowing them to pose questions, including, does the global experience of a global pandemic press us to rethink what we mean by social movements? Now my focus is on South Africa, but before I get there, I will provide further contexts. First, comparative, based on continent-wide research on protests, and secondly, historical, raising briefly a few relevant points about South Africa and democracy. Right, so the research that I want to refer to, maybe this is slightly self-indulgent on my behalf, but I think it does help us to contextualize South Africa and see some of the similarities and differences with elsewhere on the continent. Mm-hmm. It's research that arises out of media reports collected by ACLID, which some of you will know. A big project collecting data. The most important project that there is in terms of the numbers of media reports, but of course media reports always have problems. And in other research we've done on South Africa using police reports, we think that the media only cover something like 1 in 6 protests. But nevertheless, they're valuable, particularly within countries where one can assume the biases are fairly consistent and they give us therefore some sense of the trends. But to some degree, they're useful for comparison between countries, so that a country with very high levels of protest isn't a country with a very low representation of protests and vice versa. So let me then very quickly show you some of our findings. Now this first graph is on the total number of protests from 2012 to 2019. And we think that their data is pretty consistent from 2012 to the present. We wouldn't want to go before 2012 because they calculated things in different ways. Now, the first thing you can see is the rapid increase in 2019. In fact, in terms of these media reports of protests, it would seem as if there was a doubling in the number of protests between 2018 and 2019. But what I want to do is to look at what lies below that major line, that shaded area, that blue area. Now, what does that represent? How do we break it down to understand what's going on in the continent? And now it becomes very interesting because we discover that of all of those protests up to the end of 2019, more than half of them were in just 6 countries, and 45% of them were in 4 countries. And if we look at the period of 2019, that very high level of protests, more than 50% were in four countries. If we look at the increase, again, 4 countries, the increase in 4 countries was responsible for half of that increase. Now, over the period as a whole, those 4 key countries are the ones that we can see in these next graphs. And if we look, first of all, just at the number of protests, the N figure, we can see that South Africa, that second graph, has far more protests over the period than the other 3, 7,862. Of course, these are just the recorded press reports. So South Africa has a very high number of protests. Tunisia, if we look at protests per capita, Tunisia actually comes much higher than South Africa. Tunisia is far and away ahead of other countries in the continent in terms of protests per capita. And although the figure for Nigeria is higher than that for Algeria and Tunisia, it's got a very, very big population. And it comes way down in terms of protests per capita compared to the other 3 countries. But if we look at those 3 graphs, I guess one of the most significant things is what we see in Algeria. Steady increase from 2012 to 2018, and then rapid increase in 2019. And of course, this is a snapshot of a revolutionary upheaval. And if I had a graph for the Sudan up there, you'd see it looks very, very similar. In fact, it's even more sudden from 2018 to 2019. In South Africa, there's a fairly even level of protests, going up a bit in the last year. Nigeria, below that, we can see a big increase in 2015 and then a flattening out, no doubt. If we had figures for 2020, we'd see another rapid increase. And moving around the circle back to Tunisia, at first sight, it looks similar to Algeria. A decline in the number of protests after the revolution in 2010, 2011, and then a gradual increase and quite rapid in 2019. But if we look at the second set of graphs, the first set, you'll see percentage figures down the y-axis. So they're showing the distribution of the protests over that period from 2012 to 2019. The second graphs, the nice colourful ones, give us some indication of the grievances that people were raising. Now, although I would agree with various people who say that we shouldn't reduce social movements studies to protest, nevertheless, protests are very valuable. They give us some insight into the issues that people have been concerned about and who the actors are, who's doing the protesting, who's actively engaged in the social movements at the forefront of those social movements. And they give us some idea of the ups and downs of social movement activity. I think they're also very important because it's very often through participation in protests, even small protests, that people gain experience which is valuable in the much larger movements of the kind that Alessandra has described. But if we look now at Algeria and compare it with Tunisia, and we compare, first of all, the blue bars represent political grievances being raised by protesters. In the case of Algeria, you can see that that blue line is not very big until we get to last year, then suddenly up massive increase in the number of political protests. And it's interesting to compare this with Tunisia. You see the blue for Tunisia. It goes down and down. And what we now have in Tunisia is not really very many political protests, but far more socio-economic protests, represented by the grey line here. So even though the pattern at first sight looks similar for Tunisia and Algeria, the character of the protests is very different. And if we were to go to Nigeria, again, even though in the last few years it looks as if they're relatively similar in terms of the shape of people, the numbers of people involved, there's a bit of a difference in the character. Very few political protests in South Africa, quite a few of the ones we've called socio-political, that is around things like gender issues, ecology issues, and so on, bigger there than for the other countries. But very large number of socio-economic protests in South Africa, typically around service delivery, to some extent around issues like pay. So the point that I want to emphasize here is the enormous variation. If you just were to draw one graph for Africa, you would say, okay, wave of protests. But in fact, when we begin to unpick that, we see that that so-called wave is very largely represented by a tiny number of countries. And even when we contrast those countries, we see a considerable difference in terms of what people are protesting about. But hang on to a picture of the proportion of South African protests by year, because I'm going to come back to South Africa in a moment. That bulge in the middle, by the way, Alessandra will be interested, I'm sure, it represents a big student rebellion. Okay, let me go on then to say something. Can't move the thing along. Jeffrey, can you? I can't seem to move the onto the next page. Can you do it from your end? Can you hear me?
Only you can you're the only one who can do it, I think. Doesn't it work?
I've found a place to do it. Okay, great. Okay, now very briefly, so that we can understand the present, let me say a very few things about the past. South Africa achieved democracy in 1994 on the basis, primarily on the basis of a very high level of internal struggle. Very powerful shop stewards committees and very powerful street committees in the different communities. But many of the democratic gains were undermined over a period of time, at least, by the introduction of neoliberal policies, increasing the level of inequality, increasing the level of unemployment, both of which are higher now than they were before 1994. And that's given rise to a number of further forces. First of all, a small elite grabbing at things, very high level of corruption that's involved, in particular the former president, Jacob Zuma, who is now being exposed or further exposed for very high levels of corruption involving very, very many people. And secondly, increased inequality and disappointment from very large numbers of people about the failure of the government to deliver on some of the promises that it was making in 1994. In terms of the social movements, after an upturn in the number of social movements, particularly around AIDS activism at the end of the 1990s and early 2000s, and around other issues to do with service delivery, those movements have tended to go down rather, but have been replaced by an upsurge in the number of protests, often very militant protests, sometimes described as a rebellion of the poor. In terms of the workers' movement, there was a high point in 2010 with the largest strike ever amongst public sector workers. And then following the Marikana massacre, very big strikes amongst mine workers, particularly on the platinum mines, an upsurge in strike action amongst very lowly paid farm workers, the student movement that I've already mentioned. And this has had a political impact as well. It led, first of all, to a major split from the African National Congress, led by its Youth League, and it led to the formation of the Economic Freedom Fighters, by and large a left-wing version of the ANC. And then amongst a section of the workers, particularly in the largest union, the National Union of Metalworkers of South Africa, the formation of a Socialist Revolutionary Workers' Party. So the workers' movement is not united politically in the way in which it was previously, nor is the movement elsewhere amongst young people in particular. We have an increasing number of divisions, while at the same time the trade union movement, the main part of the trade union movement, and COSATU, has tended to remain loyal to the African National Congress. Not just political divisions in terms of parties, but also that COSATU has split with a new federation being formed called the South African Federation of Trade Unions, loosely aligned in the last election to that Socialist Revolutionary Workers' Party. But let me move on as quickly as possible to talk about the pandemic and its impact. Before talking about these graphs, it's worth me saying that in South Africa, the lockdown, the first part of the lockdown was very forceful. It was very difficult to move around, to get out of your house, except to go to the shops. And that created difficulties in terms of organization. Despite this very forceful lockdown, South Africa experienced many infections, very high level infections, at one point the 5th highest in the world, and with all of the countries above it having much greater populations, and actually a very large number of deaths, particularly when we take into account not only population, but the young age of the South African population, which averages just 30 years. South Africa, in my view, can be said to have done very badly in terms of COVID, and nearly half of all of the infections in Africa have actually been in South Africa. But the hard lockdown that we had kicked in towards the end of March. Now, this first graph shows us that in the early part of the year, there was an exceptionally high level of protests. And if you can cast your memory back to that earlier graph that I showed you for South Africa, 2019 had a higher level of protests than any of those previous years, and probably in terms of numbers of protests, the numbers of protests per capita, 2019 was the highest year in South African history. The month of February was actually higher than any month in 2019. So a peak in the number of protests in February, suddenly slumping, very, very rapidly slumping down to those figures in March. For 5 days in March, there were no protests at all recorded. The official lockdown was implemented from midnight in the morning, or just after midnight, if you like, 1 second after midnight, on the 27th of March. But people were preparing for it already, and that had an impact in terms of the number of protests. Now, if we skip momentarily to the graph below, I presented there, I've been working with a number of research assistants, and particularly Lefa Lenka, who may be here or may not be here, and I'm grateful to him for his assistance. But we can see there in February, that peak month of February, it was mainly residents engaged in protest action, but also in that orangey kind of color, quite a lot of workers, mostly around traditional issues such as pay. But also in February, a high level of student activism around various issues, including the level of bursaries being paid to students. What then happens, and you see it particularly in April rather than March, once the lockdown has really come into effect, no student protests. And this is because all of the students have just been sent home. There's very few students on the campus. There's no organizing being done on the campus. So a key reason why there's a slump in the number of protests is because there's no students there to protest. And that runs throughout this period, April, May, June. And if I were to include figures for subsequent months, you'd see the same thing going on there. If I return to the top graph, you'll see that from April onwards, there's an increased level of protest action. Continues after June, though the last figures that I looked at showed that it was sloping off and possibly coming down a little bit. But there was 1 week there when there were more protests than any of the weeks in February. So it's been rising to quite a high level of protest action. But those protests have been, they've mainly involved residents rather than workers. So I'm making a point here about the character of the movement in South Africa. Not only has it been increasing, but it's been concentrated primarily in the communities amongst poorer people, protesting over issues such as electricity, water, over gender-based violence, over quite a wide range of issues that are associated with communities in South Africa's townships and informal settlements. So keep those graphs in mind, and let me kind of broaden out the discussion a little bit. So early on, there were some protests amongst workers in essential services, particularly in the hospitals, with demands being raised about protective equipment, but really not a lot going on. And there have been protests in a few state-owned enterprises, notably in South African Airways and in South African broadcasting, around issues of retrenchments, primarily around retrenchments. So very defensive issues. And although there has been one major issue concerned with pay amongst in the public sector workers' union, again, it's been very, very defensive. It's because the government has refused to implement a pay increase that it had previously agreed to, on which there was a contract. So low level of strike action, very defensive action for the most part. And a key reason for this is that an enormous number of people simply lost their jobs with the hard lockdown. And unemployment increased in real terms to about 50% of the labour force. And this was associated with terrible poverty, with hunger, with all sorts of anxieties about the capacity of people to survive. So part of the problem that we're facing now is that some people are still unemployed, but a much larger number have returned to work, have got some of their work back, but still on low incomes and still trying to make up for lost income. So not a great degree of confidence amongst workers. And perhaps this is underlined best by the fact that the two big federations that I've mentioned already, COSATU and SAFTU, came together and agreed on organising a general strike. And this was something new. It was a moment of unity. They'd been at each other's throats ever since the split in COSATU. But now they recognise the importance of coming together to address the problems that the working class faced. But the general strike was a flop. Very few people indeed on strike, and not very many people protesting on the streets either. This was followed by SAFTU calling for a general strike, which would have occurred yesterday, but they postponed it because they'd done no work to prepare for it. And they're hoping to organise that strike in the new year. So certainly at the moment, this giant of a labour movement is quiescent. It's not really challenging the government. It's not fighting over issues that even employed workers are concerned with, let alone issues that concern the wider working class. The second item I put down there is the COVID-19 People's Coalition, which was initiated right at the very beginning of the lockdown. This is a broad coalition involving people from different class backgrounds and includes the NGOs. I suppose they would be the NGOs that Anki would regard as being civil society NGOs. They're ones that have some kind of mass base, that are concerned with things like the right to know, legal issues affecting working class people and so on. And also the coalition has involved people from various professional backgrounds, notably doctors, and it's been concerned with issues, for instance, like establishing a basic income grant. So this is a wide coalition organised around a number of working groups, some of them national working groups, some of them more localized. The one that I've been involved in is the community organising working group, which has limited its remit to Gauteng, which is the key province in the middle of South Africa that includes the big cities of Pretoria and Johannesburg, and most of the activism has been around Johannesburg. And I want to just talk a little bit about CALG, because although it's not massive in terms of the numbers of people involved or its impact, I think it's been interesting in terms of innovations that have occurred, which pose questions, which help to kind of develop the questions which I posed in the introduction. So let me quickly show you a few pictures which indicate some of the activity that it's been involved in. The first two pictures are about the public education, which was central in the first couple of months of CALG's existence. You can see on the left that this wasn't a public education that was at a distance from people. It wasn't about murals, it wasn't about community radio stations and the like. It was about young activists going from door to door, peer education, using those flyers or leaflets primarily as a way to open up conversations with people about the importance of wearing masks, the importance of sanitizer. And you can see the young woman on the left with a bottle of sanitizer. Sanitizer became almost like a hallmark. It's interesting, really, because it was almost like shaking hands. You can't shake somebody's hands because of COVID, but you can spray their hand, and it's a pleasant feeling. And so many of the activists enjoyed having bottles of sanitizer almost as a way of greeting people. But the activity around public education wasn't just about leaflets and arguments in a fairly formal sense, but as you can see in the next picture along, people are physically distanced with their various placards, walking through a street in the middle of an informal settlement and conveying in a kind of very powerful way the importance of key messages around protecting people. In fact, that particular group was so effective that they gained the support to close down shebeens, taverns that were acting illegally during the hard lockdown. The third picture along shows the other main activity that we were engaged in the early days, and that is the delivery of food. You'll see there the woman on the left has a big box, very heavy box, and it contained a lot of food. These were boxes that we'd got from something called the Solidarity Fund, funded to a small degree from the government, but mainly from private donations. We found it very difficult to get access to those packages. There weren't, in fact, a lot of them in the end. There weren't a lot of private donations going into this kind of work, but those that there were often went out to larger NGOs rather than to the kind of community-based organization that we were developing. But there were several food deliveries, and you can see there the element of accountability on our side, concern that people should sign for parcels so that we could account to the various donors about what we were doing. And these two activities of public education and food overlapped with each other quite a lot. The food deliveries in particular assisted us in winning arguments. The people engaged in that publication going door to door were able to identify people who are most vulnerable and most in need of food. So this built up a presence in about 17 neighborhoods, poor areas around Johannesburg. And each of these neighborhoods, there were teams, sometimes 40 or 50 people in a team working together regularly. So it wasn't just a matter, and it was, we thought about it in this way, it wasn't just a matter of providing support in very difficult times. It was also about building and rebuilding community organization, which we regarded as being very important because we expected that the government would go onto the offensive. It wouldn't just be workers trying to defend themselves, but also the government would go on the offensive against the working class. And in the bottom two photographs, I want to highlight there this word azifikalani. You see it more clearly in the banner on the right. It says, "We are hungry, we are angry, azifikalani." Now, azifikalani is basically a Zulu word, slight modification, but it's basically a Zulu word, which means I protect you, you protect me. So it conveys some sense of solidarity. But the point I want to make here is that its use was very varied. And on the left here, you can see the notion of azifikalani being used in terms of fighting gender-based violence. Big issue, particularly during the lockdown, increase in the level of gender-based violence. Comrades involved in trying to make sure that culprits were arrested and charged and went to court, but sometimes also activists dealing themselves physically with the culprits of gender-based violence. But gender-based violence certainly to do with feeding people, certainly about public education, and about a range of other issues, food, people helping each other with food gardens, mentioned by Alessandra previously, and it was linked in as well to the question of Black Lives Matter. We held several protests, if you like, relatively small because of the restrictions that were imposed, and you can see one of those on the right. This one was along the side of the road, people properly physically distanced, wearing masks and so on. And there were a number of these, sometimes people in the middle of the roads, and as time went on, we got the hang of doing this properly and used social media to publicize what we were doing internationally and locally. So that's just a snippet of the activity of the community organizing working group. I could go through a long list. There is a list in the article that Jeffrey mentioned. Let me just pick out things from the middle of the list that I put down. Advising on COVID-19 systems and what action to take, supplying soap, maintaining good relations with a shopkeeper willing to provide food, maintaining good relations with the police commander willing to tolerate a protest and check conditions in the local prison, monitoring a school for implementation of safety protocols, attending a school governing body, picketing a school, helping people who'd been shot with live ammunition and detained and beaten, allegedly for occupying land, finding legal assistance for people forcefully evicted from houses they had lived in for many years, organising community solidarity for shop workers ill-treated by their bosses, consoling a family whose daughter had been murdered in appalling circumstances, and so on and so forth. So this Asif Iqbalani meant a wide range of things that activists were involved in, particularly during the earlier phases of the lockdown, but it continued, and some of it was just picking up where people had left off before the lockdown was implemented. Some of those activities were ones that people had been conducting in their communities for quite a long time. But a point that I want to get across here is that this notion of Asif Iqbalani, you help me, I protect you, you protect me, is one which conveyed this variety of meanings. Sometimes it was very basic solidarity, getting somebody to a hospital, two people involved in that activity. Sometimes it was about delivering food and getting across messages on public education, but sometimes it was much more political and raised issues publicly and politically about violence, even international solidarity, and sometimes questions not only about food, but that related back to Madiba, Nelson Mandela, using the memory of Nelson Mandela to win arguments about solidarity and so forth. So solidarity here is interesting. It has its own particular local roots in the idea of Asif Iqbalani, and it means a range of things to different people. And it's something we could concretize in the work of the community organizing working group. Now, the level of activity in CALC has declined, and it's interesting to try to make sense of why. I'm still not too sure of it myself. I think some of it is that it required a degree of funding to undertake activities like distribution of food in particular. In part, I think it's that as the level of the lockdown has declined, people have gone back to mobilizing through other organizations. So it seems like it might have been a particular moment, but it's not clear at the moment. It's not clear just yet. And I think a number of important lessons have been learned by people who are active in the movement, in this movement, not least of which was the value of Zoom. Now, if you're in the global north, you might take this for granted, and we're using it right now. But for poor activists, it was a new thing. And we wouldn't have been able to organize without the use of Zoom, without people learning how to use Zoom nearly always on their phones. But it meant that people could organize across quite a large area, make decisions, decide whether we were going to do a particular food delivery, decide what the focus was for mobilization, and so forth. So communications have affected the capacity of poor working class people to mobilize in this way, to make democratic decisions, to discuss issues, to reach conclusions, and then to implement those decisions. So I think that's been an important step forward, and we'll have to see the extent to which it continues. One of the big problems that we face in South Africa is that the cost of data is very, very high indeed. A number of capitalists making a lot of money out of internet connectivity. Okay, I want to really now just finish off. Oh, let's have those pictures, they're much nicer. Now, if we think about some of the issues that I was raising earlier, there were first of all the ones that Anki and Dieter were asking us about distinctions between civil society and social movements. And I'm wondering here whether at this local level there is such a sharp distinction between civil society and social movements. It would seem as if this slogan of Azivikalani is both about civil society. It's pushing for improvements in the way in which people's lives are organized. It's about political change in part. And it's certainly about trying to maintain a degree of dignity and basic health in local areas. And this is something I think we find much more in Africa than in the global north, that social movements or civil society are involved in filling the gaps that are left by a failing state. And increasingly, although I wouldn't describe South Africa as a failing state, nevertheless, there are gaps there being left. It's not feeding people, it's not undertaking public education, it's not dealing with people who are engaged in, mainly men, engaged in murdering women. It's not engaged in developing food gardens and so on and so forth. So here we have examples then of things which arguably cross over between civil society and social movements. Not always a movement in the sense of large-scale mobilization, often quite small-scale activities, as you can see with the support here for distributing food. So I'm not necessarily arguing against Anki, but I'm asking her and others questions about whether we should see these as civil society activities or social movement activities, or whether with regard to slogans like Azivikalani, which cut across, and activities like the use of Zoom, whether there's something new here that may be particularly South African, but might be valuable to understand in other contexts. In response to the points that Jeffrey was raising, it seems to me that we can tick off all of the boxes for South Africa. All of his 5 roles of social movements one can find in the South African context. And maybe that's a useful framing for comparative discussion. But when we begin that comparative discussion, then we have to bring in a number of other factors. And one of them is the question of quantity. It's not enough just to talk about quality, but quantity becomes very, very important. And I try to show this in terms of the situation up to 2019 across Africa. But I've also highlighted it here by talking about the lack of mobilization amongst workers through a once very powerful trade union movement. So there may be these aspects replicated in different countries, but they're replicated to different degrees. And it may be that in one country, basic solidarity is much more important than mass protest movements. There may be differences here between the Lebanon and South Africa, and I'm looking forward to the discussion, which hopefully will explore some of these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kate. Thanks, Alexandra, for these great and insightful presentations. I think, although you talked about quite a different context, I found it particularly interesting to see how the pandemic affected the course of the previous protests in both contexts. Also, how both of you emphasized the issue of survival as a quick question, right, to triggering protests, as well the changing solidarities. I think there are also some questions in both presentations, right? And I would like to ask you 2 quick questions. Geoffrey probably also has a brief comment or question. And in this meanwhile, I also invited all of you to join the discussion as well. Please raise your hand if you like to speak, or if you prefer, just put or add your questions in the chat below. And in the meantime, I will ask this couple of brief questions. I will begin with Alexandra. And I would like to ask you, Alexandra, a question about the October uprising, because in October 2019, people have, of course, been massively, right, mobilizing, calling for the downfall of a political class, maybe as a whole, not only as a specific topic, target, but as the downfall of a political class as a whole, which ruled the country for several decades. Another interesting thing is that the protests spread to different cities in the country beyond the capital and became quite decentralized. It was not just about social movements in action, but actually much more than that. It was the society as a whole in movement, right? But I'm not talking about Lebanon. I'm talking about Chile. Interestingly, at the same time that people occupied massively the streets in October 2019 in Lebanon, the same month, Chile in Latin America experienced a truly social outbreak, right? We have, I think 1 month ago or something like that, a session on Latin America. And it's nice, quite interesting to see how in the same moment, exactly the same month, exactly the same dates, we had this discussion, this social uprising in Chile. And unlike other places with strong, where we could speak of clear channels or mechanisms of diffusion and resonance of the protest between different contexts, Chile and Lebanon share, I think, very little things among them. However, it's quite curious to me to note that there are many common features of the protests in these two contexts, in these two countries. And this makes me think that we are in fact facing a deep reconfiguration of protests and social movements in the world that's quite broad and generalized regardless of context. Although obviously context matter, of course. And these common characteristics are, for example, this kind of softer boundaries between the individual and the collectivity, much more multi-referential identities, several practical and political chains, as also Kate mentioned, about the very notion of social movements, right? So I would like to hear more from you, Alexandra, about what do you consider to be some of the main trends of these new forms of activism today in Lebanon, right? And Kate, I really like how you combine protests with social movements. Because usually the studies of protest events, right, end up leaving aside solidarities, identities, culture. So I think we had, like in the last two decades in social movement studies, a kind of separation between event protest analysis and social movement studies. But in this case, I would like to ask you about this relationship, but also I have a more methodological question. Maybe I missed something, I don't know, but I would like to know what types of source are you working on with this database of protests that you have presented to us? Are they newspapers or are there other sources in these databases? If you can explain me, it would be nice. Thank you.
Okay, well, I also have some questions after these two very insightful presentations. It's really great to carry on our work in this seminar, because it's really, as Kate ended up in her conclusion, each country is definitely different. And yet the analysis resonates so much with what we've heard or what we are seeing in different countries. It's just that thanks to your talks, we are looking at difference with a different perspective on the countries we are working on. So this is really great, and that's definitely the aim of this seminar, as it has been in the last nine years at the Colegio Mundial. And there were three arguments in there. I would just take three. In case insists that after lockdown, protests moved from workers to residents in more protestant communities topics, gender, housing, and more. This is exactly what John Krinsky told us about last week in New York City. He didn't see so much on the gender perspective, but at least on the importance of the housing and housing right movements. So we see something very similar in the United States and in South Africa, in the global North and in the global South. But at the same time, I don't claim it's the same. We'll just say that it invites us to see some similarities. Likewise, the importance of the reorganization and of workers' movements with new alliances. This is also a key topic. We worked a bit on it with Sabrina Sayak, the vice president of the Research Committee 47, on these new alliances. I think this is something that we see very clearly in this pandemic context. We see it, for example, with the workers in the United States around Amazon and other geek technological companies, with new alliances between unions and different forms of movements. And also in both of your talks, as in many other talks, we see also that food take a new importance today. Brenner already outlined it, but also the fact that growing food, preparing food, distributing food has become a focus of many practices in movements. And with food, of course, it's not only about eating, it's also about solidarity, being together. It's a social connection. So that's also a topic that you have raised in two different contexts, but that will go far beyond that. One of my questions, one to Kate and one for both of you. So Kate, I wonder a bit about this, your very interesting numbers and graphics. Can we distinguish social, political, and social economic in protest? For what I could see, I think that after, of course, already with the global justice movements, but even more in the last decades, the movements are actually bringing very much together social, economic, political, and what used to be called post-materialist values. For instance, when they talk about dignity, they ask me to live with dignity, housing, work, and to have sufficient money to live with dignity. That's exactly what they say in Chile, that what they used to say in the Arab revolutions. So how can we distinguish it? And especially today when we see a rising role of women in many movements. So my question is it also the case in South Africa? We see a rise of women as a coordination of many movements with increasing transversal topics. So it's not only that gender movements are led by women, but also we see it in solidarity economy, we see it in new unions, we see a number of political actors also. We see differently in Alexandra Brian PhD dissertation. You see a very important role of women in the protests in Lebanon. Likewise, we see it in many movements. We see it in politics too, in Brazil, in the United States. Ocasio-Cortez may be the most famous case, but anyway. So how do you see the transversality of some of these topics and the role of women? And then for both of you, a more methodological question. You are both committed scholars in very different ways. You are both activists and scholars. It involves in very different contexts and with very different movements. And I would like to ask you, how do you see your relationship with the actors? And also if Kate could tell us a bit more about how she connects it very well with the way she organizes a research group, research center, and how research is actually, how she thinks about university, academics, and research connected to the actors and with the actors, which is really one of the most, many insightful points that she is bringing in the academia. I think so. If you both say a few words about it, it would be great. So I think
Thank you, Jeffrey. Yeah, we have 3 questions already in the chat. I don't know, Kate and Alexandra, do you prefer to answer our question first or collect more questions maybe?
I think we probably have the time to collect the question afterwards so that everyone could speak in the debate.
Okay, so let's do that. Your mic is off, Alexandra.
Okay. So would you like to start or it's up to you?
No, I'd rather you went first.
Yeah, actually I had the same. before answering the question, I actually had almost the same question that Geoffrey was asking about this distinction between the social and the political, which in the Lebanese case, for example, it's extremely hard to dissociate, because when we look at the struggle against the sectarian system is also against the political economy of sectarianism, and so it's very hard to disentangle and separate these different aspects. And also the notion of dignity, for example, was very much present in the October uprising. So I would like also very much to ask you about that. Breno, concerning your question, actually, I was just like trying to find it now, and I will send it later. I remember when we were in the protest in October, there was a graffiti, and in this graffiti, it was I forgot what it was in Spanish, but it was, a friend explained that it was basically in solidarity with the protester in Chile, and I found that really fascinating and very interesting to see how two countries, which pretty much have nothing in common, and there was this kind of and there wasn't, as I'm aware of, any kind of discussion between the activists or so on, but they very much felt the solidarity where we could really see in Montjuïc Square something talking about Chile. So, and also this is not the case only about this protest and the October uprising. I remember when once we were discussing about the Beirut Medinati, for example, when basically the activists left their comfort zone and decided to run for municipal election, and there was a colleague in Brazil also who was presenting Flavia, and I remember we also found many connections. And I think maybe what all this has in common, it's very much, it comes back to young people's relation with politics and their disenchantment with traditional politics and their struggle to try to reinvent politics through different ways. So whether we look at the October uprising or at the post-war anti-sectarian movement, which pretty much paved its way, we could really see how the young people and the activists were very much struggling with this relation, to reinvent politics. So at first, we could see, if you look at the history of the movement, at first there was this very distance from politics. I had even activists telling me explicitly, we don't do politics. This was, this is what they told me in an interview, while what they were doing was very, obviously, very, very political. And so it was a way to really distance themselves from the traditional, sphere of conventional politics. But then throughout the years, the militants very much realized, and also this is also very much related to the fact that although they staged big demonstration, because their idea was like, no one is listening to us because we're not enough in the streets. But then they were enough in the street and still the government never listened to them. And so they decided to leave their comfort zone and very much engage into politics differently, while at the same time, and still keeping this, their own alter-activist type of engagement. So they were really trying to practice the value that they endorsed through a different way, having these horizontal democratic, organization, and in a different way. So I think this is what they have in common, and this is also at the basis of their common struggles, which is this difficulty today to really translate their demands into clear, political, into political terms, and to translate it into policies and so on. So I would say that today, and this is why, and this is why also, it raises the question of how that Kate raised at the very beginning. How can we rethink today's social movements? And maybe this is one of the way we could try to rethink it today in relation to politics and what politics means to these young people today, how they're trying to reinvent it through different ways, and what politics means. So for the activists after the Beirut blast, for example, distributing a food box were a very political act for certain of them. But for others who were involved in civil society organization and in NGO for many years, it wasn't a political act. It was just an act of charity. And so this understanding of politics very much varies. And maybe this is where we need to go. And concerning Geoffrey's question about being at the same time in active, like writing about these movements, and I think it's always a very difficult question when how I try to translate. If we're going to talk about methodology, I always try to translate it with. That's why I always favor very participatory approaches, for example, because it's the only way where I feel that also I'm not talking on the behalf of the militants. So that's why I rather do that. But also it's very tricky sometimes because of course we have our own political opinions and we don't always agree in terms of strategy or practical steps to take with the militants. So it's kind of always tricky. We need to be always very reflective about our own position in different situation, I guess. Frankly, it was way easier when I was constantly traveling, for example, to Paris, because this physical distance also helped very much in terms of writing, for example, and in terms of reflection. So sometimes when we're too much within the movement and part of the movement, it's very hard to write about it, and it's very, very challenging, and that's why so I don't know. I think it's a question that I also always ask myself, and there's no easy answer, I guess.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, perfectly.
Okay, well, thanks very much for the questions. They were very, very challenging. And I hope that you'll save the chat for us so we can have a look at that afterwards. I do want to pick up on one thing in the chat raised initially by Marcel Parrott and then by Anki, and that's about Black Lives Matter. I think that there was some resonance. I wouldn't want to exaggerate it. It's obviously not at the level it was in Britain, for instance. It raises some resonance. There is some resonance partly because there are issues of racism which are still significant for people in South Africa. So it touched on that call. And it was great to see people in America mobilizing the way in which they did. So it was also encouraging for people in South Africa. What I think is interesting is that, there are far more deaths at the hands of the police in South Africa than there are in America. They're fairly regular things. And right at the beginning of the lockdown, 7 or 8 people were killed, including one which was photographed. And it didn't lead to protests at all. So then you think, well, why is this? Why is it that the American protests excites far more action and concern than killings in South Africa? And there was some interesting discussion about this on the Review of African Political Economy blog. And I'm still not quite sure about the answer. I think it's a very important question. Sometimes, in Tunisia, for instance, self-immolation will help spark off a massive protests, but it doesn't always do that. Sometimes a worker can be sacked, nothing happens. Sometimes a worker can be sacked and there's a big strike. So there's something about particular moments in time and the way in which a mood builds up, which just needs some kind of trigger to set the thing off. Now, there was a particular angle on this, and I think it goes to a question that Anki is raising. And that was, we had in a place called Eldorado Park, south of Johannesburg, a historically coloured area. That is an area for basically people who are not white, and they're not Black Africans, and they're not Indians. So some are kind of mixed race, some come from different kinds of backgrounds around the world. If you like, very, very mixed. But it's really a kind of marker that was derived at by the apartheid state, and particularly under the Group Areas Act. Certain people were designated coloured, and they had to live in particular areas like Eldorado Park. So here was a horrible case of a kid who couldn't speak properly, killed by police, who'd actually put buckshot, in other words, live ammunition, but big bullets into his cartridge, which would normally be used, I think, in that occasion, for rubber bullets. Rubber bullets are commonplace in South Africa. They're used to disperse crowds all of the time. It's much cheaper and easier than using police with batons or anything like that. But he'd actually used his buckshot and killed this kid. So then the question is, well, what slogan should be raised? And you couldn't raise the slogan Black Lives Matter, because now in South Africa, unlike the situation in the 1980s, Black really refers to Black Africans. So some people in Eldorado Park wanted to raise the slogan of Coloured Lives Matter. But obviously that wasn't something which we wanted to see ourselves, because we were concerned with trying to encourage unity rather than those kinds of divisions. So, but Black Lives Matter, Coloured Lives didn't work. Some people, of course, argued for all lives matter, which in the South African context isn't such a bad thing. But then it kind of connects with debates about all lives matter as an international debate going on. So we kind of recoiled from that. And it was very difficult to resolve it. I think probably in the end, they settled on our lives matter, you know, which was quite a nice way of kind of capturing it in El Dorado Park and a bit more. You know, the our is a bit vague, but it kind of highlights the problems of dealing with, of trying to forge unity in a particular South African context. I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to, I'm worried about talking for too long, so I'm not going to be able to respond to everything that that Jeffrey and Brenno have raised. I was interested in what John Krinsky had to say last week as well. I mean, he was talking mainly about New York. And he said that there's been, I wrote it down because it was interesting. He says there's been no rupture. But what's happened makes old issues more urgent. And I would say the same about South Africa. You know, what I've seen is, you know, there's no rupture at all, you know, but things are more urgent. People are more hungry. Housing has become a bigger issue, partly because people can't afford rents because they haven't got the money. So they have to try to occupy land to put up new shacks. And then they come up against the landowners and come up against the state, and there can be big collisions then. You've mentioned the question of food. I don't want to exaggerate that. I don't think it's at the moment a massive movement, though there is a movement there. So COVID is making issues more urgent. Unemployment, poverty, so on and so forth. That's I think undoubtedly the case. There was a question about the basic income grant. Yes, important. Still, it's been raised more, I think, during COVID. So this would be an income grant, hopefully to everybody, even better off people, but they would then have to be paying more tax. Very efficient way of providing social benefits. Question about 2019. Well, most of that increase in 2019 again was about residents, so it reflects the frustration, the build up, the concerns with basic issues that develop in poor communities. Okay, now I was being challenged a bit about, not challenged, but asked about ACLED, the Armed Conflict Location and Event Database. Well funded by the American State Department, which I don't think is a bad thing. It's good to see the State Department helping us with information that we can use perhaps against them one day. They depend on a range of sources, and they're now developed from an initial base in Central Africa, across Africa, India, and now cover most of the world with their database. For some reason, probably to do with the State Department, they don't yet cover North America. They don't cover France. Sorry about that, Jeffrey. They don't cover Germany. Sorry about that, Anki. But Brenno, I'm sure you'll be pleased to know that they cover Latin America. Anyway, so they've got a massive database. I've forgotten how many entries, about 600,000 entries on it now, based upon mainly on media reports, but international media and local media, so fairly good coverage there. And where there are problems with getting media reports, they sometimes have got their own local sources that they've developed, and use social media selectively. You know, if it's the social media of a known journalist, they might draw on that, but they're not going to draw on my social media. Not that there's much there to say, but so they're rather selective about that. So it's, I mean, you know, we've tested it against our South African data, and we find that where we've just used local media in South Africa, and we've got their stuff as well, they've got slightly more protests than we have now because they've got international media, although they haven't got the same depth in terms of the local newspapers and so on. The key thing in using this stuff is to look at their notes, because you need their notes to work out whether an event is a protest or not. That's the first thing. And many people have used their database, get it completely wrong, and they get all the numbers wrong and they misunderstand it. So you have to look at their notes. And then the notes are the clues to who the actors are and what the grievance is about. And in fact, in practice, in most cases, you can tell what the grievances are about. You know, it would be nice to think that there's all this mixture of politics and socioeconomics all going on at the same time. Though it was interesting that in Alexandra, in a beginning, in a first comment, said we were all fighting about different issues to start with, and then it became together because there was some kind of common cause. Now, I suspect if you probe to see what these different issues are about, you could begin to distinguish, you know, that there are issues about, in South Africa, about service delivery, which are distinct from issues about pay, which are distinct from issues being raised by students, which are distinct from issues about gender-based violence, and so on and so forth. So in an iterative manner, we worked out a list of about 15 or 13 or something like that grievances. And what I presented was simply an aggregation of some of those into those, I think, 3 or 4 categories as a way of indicating trends. One of the little interesting things there is that South Africa, with its liberal constitution, does create space for more protests over rights than one sees, for instance, in North Africa. But it may also be that we have far more crime. You know, you see lots of protests about crime in South Africa and in Nigeria, and you don't see many of those in North Africa. I don't know what happens in the Lebanon. So I think it's actually a very useful database if used properly. Now, I'm sure I've missed things. Maybe I'll remember them if we have got time for another round.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Alexandra. I think you have also replied the questions that was out in the chat. So now we have another question. Hakan, please. You want to?
Thank you. My name is Håkan Thörn. I'm based at Gothenburg University, Sweden. And I would like to thank you for 2 really fascinating presentations. And I've done research on the anti-apartheid movement internationally, and I also done some research also on the Treatment Action Campaign. So I tried to follow activism in South Africa, which is a very, lively social movement context, I think, has been for a very long time. So I have a couple of questions for Kate. And the first one is, because you were saying that something that characterizes the recent wave in South Africa is this focus on poor people's issues. And I was thinking about the Abahlali movement that emerged, I think, around 2010. The Shaktwales movement, and they were also very active in international networks, the Right to the City internationally. So my first question is really, have they in some way fed into the more recent wave, or what is the status of their activism in this moment? And then secondly, I support your questioning of constructing a sharp boundary between what we would, consider to be classical social movement activism and civil society activities. I think South Africa's history shows us that not only recently, but also historically, we've had broad coalitions. I mean, in the case of anti-apartheid in South Africa and internationally, of course, churches and left-wing activists and human rights activists joined together in a social movement. And I think the only way to approach that issue is to treat it as an empirical question. So whether an NGO is part of a social movement or not is an empirical question. It may be today, but in 10 years, it may work as an extension of the government or whatever. So I think that not just now, but also historically, those boundaries have always been kind of porous or loose. But I would still like, as a second question, ask you, as someone based in South Africa, if you see some difference qualitatively, significant difference in this regard, if you compare activism right now that you've been talking about and the history of the anti-apartheid struggle. Thank you.
Okay, I think this is the only question that you have at the moment. So please, Kate, if you like.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Hakan. I don't really have much of anything to say about Abaklali. And I don't know whether that's because they haven't been in the forefront of activity or just because of my own ignorance. You know, of course, as you know, there's quite a lot of social and geographical distance between where Abaklali have been most active in Durban and what happens in Johannesburg. In Johannesburg, I have done some work with Abaklali in Freedom Park, who have been at the center of a big housing movement, which I think I think was been the most important and impressive movement amongst residents. It's got beyond particular areas and has united residents across a whole swathe of to the south of Johannesburg, in coloured areas as well as in black areas. I think early on they weren't very active, but they became more active. So they're another example of a kind of resurgence of an older movement that was moved itself to the back at the beginning of the lockdown, and have been trying to organise with others, including ourselves. It was a fairly interesting day of action. What was it now? 1st of September, something like that. It all blurs, COVID blur, you know, they worked together with some marginalised workers, with CALG and so on, and organised, pulled off quite a decent national protest, which occurred in very rural areas as well as in urban areas. So that's not very satisfactory, is it? Still, best I can do. Anti-apartheid movement. I think there's a lot of similarities. You know, I spoke earlier about shop stewards movements and street committees and so on. And I think that distinction between these two separate terrains of struggle is still very present in South Africa. And I think it's marked out more strongly in South Africa than elsewhere because of the social geography, if you like, of the major cities, with big divisions between residential areas where most working class people live and the kind of workplaces where most people work, mostly in the city centre, sometimes to the sides of the city, often between the white areas and the black areas. So people have got a long way to move in the bigger cities between where they work and where they live, and obviously different issues that people are protesting about. So this reinforces, and in some ways is the root of the sectionism that I was concerned to insist upon earlier on. Now, for me, one of the interesting things about Zoom and what's happened there is that we found that in our group, a number of the community leaders, although in a sense mobilizing and representing poor unemployed people, did actually have jobs. Sometimes in an NGO, sometimes one, for instance, working as a paramedic. And I have a student who's looking at the use of Zoom. And one of the things I find interesting is that, you know, from the point of view of people who've got jobs, it's much easier for them to continue to be community activists and engage in community meetings or coalitions of community activists if they've got Zoom. They can do it at work, they can do it from a distance, and it helps to kind of overcome some of those problems to do with time. Of course, it also helped to overcome some of the separation from, you know, a white, aging professor and much younger, much poorer black community activists. I skipped the question about it. I think it's a very difficult question. I had a feeling that Alexandra was also struggling a little bit about the issue, and I think it is tricky because, well, certainly in my case with this thing recently, it was a bit like being Charlie Chaplin. You know, we had a meeting of the C19 blah blah in Gauteng, and it was a bit like, well, who's going to do such and such? And so I get nominated, and I find myself trying to coordinate this group of poorer community activists, and it wasn't something I could avoid doing. You know, it was a kind of responsible thing to do. As quickly as I could, I pulled back and tried to get other people to take the lead. And as Alexandra says, you can't really avoid some of the political arguments that go on either. You know, so that becomes tricky. There's also problems of, I think, of time management, as probably Jeffrey will complain about me. No, he's very kind. So that it probably means I get my articles in late because I've got more pressing things to do. Okay, that's enough from me for now, I think. Let me just, if I may, sorry, chairs. It comes back to this issue of civil society. let me deal with the question of civil society. I'm currently involved in helping out on some kind of country study that probably happening in other countries. It's funded by the Treasury of all people in South Africa, with chapters on different things like education, health, and so on. And they've got one really tacked on at the end about civil society. So I'm one of the kind of researchers and authors of that chapter. And we've had some discussion about the state attitude towards, civil society, and recognize it's really schizophrenic. On the one hand, it wants civil society, but sees it really as a kind of handmaiden of government. Civil society is great. They can do things for you. They can fill some of the gaps that you can't have. They can support you. Maybe, by doing things, you might even get a few extra votes in elections. That kind of mentality, but it's you do what we say. On the other hand, they also have a view of civil society, which is that these are people who are in constant rebellion against us. It's a kind of notion of uncivil society. So there's this tension from the point of view of the government, and I think it's a tension that can also exist on the ground. Somehow you've got to work out ways of surviving. That can be working with, for instance, the police. On the other hand, you protest, and the police are there with their rubber bullets firing at you. So there's a kind of schizophrenia present in movements, which you have to find ways of overcoming in terms of theorizing it, organizing, and so on. Just finally, sorry, on this other issue that I raised of there being different kinds of demands, I noticed quite an interesting article by Adam Harris and Erin Hearn, who are in part concerned to understand South Africa and contrast South Africa with North Africa in terms of the kind of protests that occur. And I might have some disagreements with them about their over homogenization, if you like, about what's been happening in North Africa. But they use the term valence protests, which will probably be familiar to those of you who are political scientists. I'm not, so it wasn't familiar. I could see some sense in it, in that, they're trying to capture this idea of these kind of everyday protests around people's immediate concerns, the problems that they face and so on. And these valence protests being quite different from the ones that concern with political structure. And I found that distinction quite useful, partly because when one can think about how do you move from one to the other, under what circumstances, what's the significance of the valence protests when you do get big movements. And I'm sure Alexandra has more to say about that than I could possibly say.
Thank you, Kate. Alexandra, do you have any final comment? We are approaching the end of the session, so. You have the mic off again.
Yes, I guess it's unmuted now. As a final comment, it's very hard, but I think it really invites us to very much rethink this question of civil society and social movement, and the question you asked from the beginning, also in relation to, what politics is. Just I want maybe to clarify just one point at the beginning. I said, yes, of course, they had this very wide range of demands, but all these struggles and all these demands are very much interrelated in the context, in the Lebanese context. So it's very hard, for example, the sectarian system is a patriarchal system. It's a neoliberal system. It's very difficult to untangle and to separate these struggles. So yes, there was a wide range of demands, but there was really one. So that's why for me, I find it very hard also to distinguish between the social and the political and the economic in this in a sense. So maybe I just wanted to add that, but it's been very interesting, and I guess it raises many questions.
Chair, can I just tack on, in case I was misunderstood? I'm in favour of bringing all struggles together, of course, and I think most people on the left are trying to work out ways in which you can do this, and people will argue that we are suffering because of the political situation, and so forth. So that's a constant struggle to bring things together. But I think there are moments when it happens and moments when it doesn't happen, and it's not necessarily easy to predict them. But what one can do is to try to develop the kind of politics which prepares the ground for uniting working class struggles, as has occurred in many places over the last few years. But it's tough, and it's tough partly because of the political divisions within the working class, and then there's problems of what is the working class. I think we've begun to settle that in trade union meetings and so on in South Africa. I think there's now a recognition that the working class isn't just the employed workers, it's also the unemployed. And then there's questions of how do you deal with kind of middle layers, how do you do, et cetera, all of the usual kind of problems. I think that one final thing is that I think the key issue is to do really with the government and the politics and the extent to which the government becomes unpopular. And still there is a degree of support for the current president, Ramaphosa, even though he's a very wealthy capitalist and implementing pro-capitalist politics. There is a measure of support for what he's been doing during the pandemic, under the lockdown. I think that's partly because there aren't alternatives yet. But I suspect that at some point, when you look at those kind of those graphs, you can see points of takeoff when people are becoming more and more fed up. They're engaging in more struggles, more and more the struggles are becoming political, and then you begin to get to more of a kind of Lebanese or Algerian situation. Thanks.
Many thanks, Kate. Many thanks, Alexandra. Unfortunately, our time is over. We're finishing our session, but we are also finishing our seminar as a whole in 2 weeks, in a couple of weeks. So I would like to remember two things, right? The first one is that the videos of our sessions will soon be available on the website of the Collège d'Études Mondiales, which is our institutional host. Also will be available at the website of the Latin American Sociological Association, which is also supporting our sessions. And the second reminder is that we will have our last session in 2 weeks, on December 17. In this closing session, we will gather several scholars, several colleagues from different continents again, always with this kind of global perspective that we like to push. So the leitmotif will be a discussion on the state of democracy and social movements in the past year, since the beginning of the pandemic, as well as the challenge we have ahead. I think we will announce the details during the next days. Geoffrey always sends these kind of friendly reminders about our session, so I'm sure he will do again in a few days, right, Geoffrey?
Sure. Yes, so I'll send it well next week. In case it's the same Zoom address, so that's
true. Yeah.
Easy. I would also like to thank not only the two fantastic speakers today, Alexandra and Alexandra Garcia, and also everyone for the question, for being present here, and our colleagues who follow us on Facebook. So I think that's it, but it's just the beginning of the debate. We will for sure carry on with Alexandra and Kate in many other seminars, and hopefully with Peter, Anja, Hakan, and every one of you in the next semester too. Bye.
Thank you all. See you soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you. Thank you.
Bye.